Governor Rick Snyder's office has released a number of emails that now reveal that it turns out a number of his aides knew about the Flint water crisis more than a year before the press did and more than a year before anything was done about it. Now, according to these emails that were obtained by Detroit News, they reveal that top aides to Michigan Governor Rick Snyder were issuing warnings over the water quality in Flint as far back as October of 2014, a year before the city switched out its own contaminated water supply and reconnected to Detroit's. The governor himself was not a recipient of these emails, but his closest advisors were, including his chief of staff, deputy chief of staff, and communications director. Now, his chief of staff, or I'm sorry, the governor's chief counsel was not too happy about what he found about the water, right? Because he had family members that were still living in that area, and he was concerned that they were drinking this water that, by the way, car companies didn't even want to use because of how corrosive it was. He said, "To anyone who grew up in Flint as I did, the notion that I would be getting my drinking water from the Flint River is downright scary." That's according to one of the emails.
So that's, what, about a year before they let the public know. So they know, right? They knew, and they were worried about it. To me, one of the other things we found out in this story, which is dispositive of how much they knew and how little they care about you, is that they started passing out bottled water to the government workers in Flint a year before they let the citizens know. So you don't pass out the bottled water and say, don't drink the tap water to the people you care about, right? Unless you already know the water is problematic. They didn't do that in other cities. They did it in Flint because they knew that you shouldn't be drinking the water. Are you going to tell the citizens? No. And they said, why not? And there are people internally saying, don't drink the water. My mom is there. I'm worried about my mom, right? Then they ask, and they said, no, too expensive. Now they're asking the federal government, Republicans who hate federal government largesse, are now asking the federal government for $850 million to fix the problem that they could have fixed for a couple of $1 million earlier. But no, they're going to save money. Why?
Save money.
Because they gave over $1 billion in tax cuts to corporations in Michigan. They gave all the money away already to the corporations who got them elected in the first place, so they didn't have a measly $1 or $2 million not to poison you. So now it's going to cost a lot more, and they're going to just spread all that cost onto us. The corporations still get all the benefits. You get poisoned, and the rest of us have to pay the bill.
I mean, politicians have become so corrupt that it's gotten to a point where you elect people to represent you, and they do the exact opposite. They don't represent you at all. The role of the government, if you ask me, is simply to protect the people, right? And in this case, they didn't protect the people. They did everything, the antithesis of that. You know,
to make them vulnerable.
Exactly. And it's just disgusting to know that they knowingly toyed with the health of these individuals and just didn't care.
They know Legionnaire's disease is happening because of the water. And they're like, because your life doesn't matter to them because you're not in power. So it's like all the people they throw in jail and they get solitary confinement. And we don't care. You don't have power. You're here to get crushed by us.
That's right.
And so now, in a recent poll of young Americans, we found out that they were enormously liberal, gigantically liberal on every issue. The only thing that the pollsters said that they were not liberal on is they significantly dislike government. But it's not a liberal position to like a corrupt government. Of course we don't like that government. It's the powerful working against the powerless. That's everything we fight against. So these guys, they don't get it, man. Both liberals and conservatives can't stand the corruption anymore.
Look, oftentimes when you talk about things like public education, for instance, or even healthcare, the argument against making it public, the argument against publicly funding it and making it widely available to everyone is, do you really want the government in charge of things like this? Because look at what they've done. Look at what happened with the Flint water crisis. This leads to more arguments against things that we should be doing in the country, keeping public education free, making sure that healthcare is available to everyone. This is government corruption. This isn't just government not knowing what they're doing. They know exactly what they're doing. You have to make sure you solve the corruption in order to continue on with policies that make sense.
And this is what happens when you elect people who tell you that the problem in your life is government and government doesn't work. So when you elect them, they immediately break government, and especially the parts that work. Flint's water worked before Rick Snyder. Rick Snyder says government doesn't work. It's the problem. We elect him. He breaks what works in the government. And that's what happens. That's what George Bush did. That's what they're doing. George Bush couldn't get a bottle of water to New Orleans for 5 days.
Yeah. And then he'll turn around and go, see, I told you, government doesn't work.
Government doesn't work.
Yeah, if you're in charge of it.
Yeah.
And why don't we run against Rick Snyder? Who's the guy who lost to Rick Snyder? Who's the guy who lost? I don't understand who loses to this guy.
Well, when Jeb Bush finally dropped out, that was the main point I said. Jimmy, Jeb Bush won 2 elections easily in Florida when he appears to be the worst candidate we've ever seen, right? I mean, the guy who lost to him, you know what he did? He did the double swivel, right? He's like, oh, come on, give me a break. I couldn't even beat Jeb Bush. You know why? Because nobody's paying attention to a Michigan governor's race or a Florida governor's race. You pour in all your money, you buy all the ads. They only hear one side of the story. So, and then we go and say the American people are stupid. No, they only heard one side of the story. If you only heard one side of the story, you'd probably agree with that side. Nobody ever else told them the other side because they didn't have enough money.
So the corporate media says Rick Snyder's a reformer. Right? That's how they position him, as a reformer. He's cutting the budget. He's cutting taxes. He's returning the government to the people. And he's also, by the way, he's poisoning you.
Oh, one last thing about Flint, Michigan. That $850 million bill in federal aid that would go to Michigan to help the poison people there, it is being held up, which is surprising, right? It's being held up by one intransigent senator, Ted Cruz.
Jeez.
And Ted Cruz says, I'm putting a hold on it. I want to study it. While people are still have that water, right? While your kids are still getting that water, Ted Cruz would like to study it further because he's not sure he wants to spend the money on unpoisoning your kids.